Welcome to Podcast 83, a regular look at the news, stories, and trends related to Michigan's 83 counties from the Michigan Association of Counties.
All right, welcome everyone to Podcast 83, the podcast put on by the Michigan Association of Counties. Today we have Sam Gibson and Madeline Fata of our government affairs staff. Unfortunately, Dina could not join us today, but we've got Sam and Madeline here in her place. And you know what they say, when the cat's away, the mice will play. So we have carte blanche to kind of talk about what we want without Dina here to keep us on track or yell at us. So I'll leave it up to you guys to kind of see where we go today. How's that sound?
Sounds fun.
Perfect.
Right. The enthusiasm is palpable. Thank you. All right. So obviously we'll talk a little bit about our conference here in a minute. That's the kind of the highlight of last week that consumed most of our weeks. But we also had a lot of movement in the legislature on some of the subcommittee budgets. So Sam, why don't we start with you a little bit, or both of you actually. Why don't you guys talk a little bit about the budgetary process first, where we're at in it, where we expect it to go, and then we'll talk about some of these specific budgets that we're watching and what impact it had on counties. So either one of you can open it up with budget process and go from there.
I can get started. Right now, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, either one of you, but all subcommittees in both chambers have reported their budget recommendations. So that's where we're at now. The full House and Senate Appropriations Committees are going to meet this week on Wednesday to go over the subcommittee chair's budget recommendations. We have the Consensus Revenue Estimating Conference coming up on Friday, May 19th. Once that takes place, we'll have a better understanding of how much money the state actually has and what we can afford in these budgets. I think some of them are a little over the governor's budget recommendation, but we'll have to wait for the estimating conference to really see where we're at. And I know, or go ahead, Steve, sorry.
Yeah, so they're going to meet this Wednesday. Now, typically, the full approps committee won't alter a subcommittee's budget, typically, right? Especially this early in the process, because they haven't even really got. I mean, they've gotten some, I guess, artificial targets, you know, right? But really, we're not going to see anything on budgets that's true until after the consensus revenue estimating conference. Correct?
Yes.
Yeah. And technically, they have until, I believe, the end of June to finalize the budgets, but we've heard rumblings that they're aiming for June 1st. So June 1st is when final versions should be out.
Right. Yeah. I mean, there's statute, not legislation, but statute that actually says they need to be done by July 1st, but there's no teeth to it that there's any penalty if they don't. It's kind of like a target that they have. But yeah, you know, that's interesting that you say that, you know, June 1st and somewhat surprising if you think about it, because you have such a newer legislature, young green legislature, that they would be moving it up 30 days for people that have never been through a budget before, right? So it'll be interesting to watch, because she also brought up the point, and we'll talk a little bit more about the individual budgets here in a second, but a lot of those subcommittee recommendations were above the governor's recommendation. And, you know, we're expecting the governor's, or if you look at the governor's recommendation now, based on what's been appropriated away or annually appropriated away since her recommendation, it's a little bit underwater. So her recommendation is already underwater, yet we have subcommittees recommending more. It's, you know, and we still don't know where our CREC is yet. So a lot of moving targets, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I've heard that the governor's budget rec is 600 million over what the state currently has. Granted, we have to wait for CREC, but those are the rumblings at the moment.
Yeah. So we don't want to get too excited right now, but I think it is important to talk about what are some of those key sub budgets that we often watch. So Madeline, why don't you first talk about, I know you're tracking MDOT, Eagle, and general government, along with Dina and some of those areas. So why don't you hit on a couple of those budgets on some key areas that we might be interested in?
Sure. So I'll start with general government, because that's probably the most relevant to our members, most exciting for our members. Back when the governor made her initial recommendations in February, I believe it was, she had included a 17% hike in revenue sharing. That was broken into different segments. That was 5% ongoing, 5% one time. And then there was 7% for public safety, and that was 5% one time, 2% ongoing. And the House did exactly that. They included everything that the governor recommended, which is awesome. The Senate did not. The Senate did include the 10% in just general revenue sharing, but they did not include that public safety piece. So it'll be interesting to see when those two committees confer how they'll do it, what will get included and what won't. If we want to transition into roads, which is one of my favorite topics, we can talk the MDOT budget. Both the House and Senate versions were a little over $200 million more than what the governor had recommended. But a lot of that is for local road programs, which is awesome. The House included $400 million for local road preservation that would be distributed to local road agencies based on population. So if that sticks around, I mean, that'll be awesome for some of our county roads.
So that was 400 million above what the governor had recommended, or was did part of her budget recommendation include that 400? No, nothing. So that's 400 solid new dollars.
Yes, but so their total budget's 220 over what the governor recommended. 400 million was for this program, but then they cut 200 million from her bridge bundling program. They did not include her bridge bundling program besides a $100 placeholder. Okay. So that's where the discrepancy is. That's where the math adds up.
No, they often use those $100 placeholders as negotiating pieces through the conference committee process and all that. So that's interesting. And so the distribution of that 400 million, can you repeat that again? That's not PA 51, that's population based.
It'll be based on population. Yep.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Sorry. Do you want to touch on Eagle?
Yeah, for sure. So the Eagle budget in the House was very interesting. They recommended 100 million more than the governor had, but that was not using general fund dollars. That was using federal funding. So they kind of found a loophole where they did make cuts to the governor's recommendation of general fund dollars, but they plan to spend more total. Am I making sense?
Yes, but not state general fund dollars through federal options.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. So they made a bunch of cuts in general fund dollars, supplemented it mostly with the coronavirus state fiscal recovery fund dollars.
So they're ARPA dollars.
Yep. So that was a very creative move on their part. The Senate did not reflect that. The Senate did make cuts to the governors, but they did not do the supplement with federal funds at all.
So that'll be interesting to see, because the state's ARPA dollars are subject to the guidelines that many of the counties had too, right? They've got to be related to COVID. You know, obviously, if you were 10 million or less in a county, and it was considered revenue loss, you could base it's general fund at that point. But this is using 100. How much federal dollars did you say a number on that federal dollar? Do you know?
Not total, but the biggest chunk was that the governor had proposed 225 million for replacing lead lines, and the House cut 110, or they cut $100 million off of the general fund, replaced with federal dollars. So they saved themselves $100 million right there.
Right.
But they are using that same federal fund dollars for several other programs as well. So I don't know the total in federal dollars.
Yeah, interesting that they were able to do that there. But the Senate didn't do any of that, right?
The Senate did not. So again, that'll be very interesting to see when they get together what makes the cut and what doesn't.
Yeah, that will be. Sam, you want to talk a little bit about DHHS, Laura, and then I think you had a general government topic you were tracking as well.
I would love to. I'll start with the DHHS budgets. Happy to report that both the House and Senate included the increase to 75% reimbursement from the state in the county child care fund. That's part of the Juvenile Justice Task Force's recommendations and was also in the governor's budget rec. So both budgets have that. I'd like to see that get to the finish line, of course. And just want to emphasize that 75% is only for community-based services. So residential will remain at 50%. And there will be bills introduced shortly that will reflect that 75% in statute.
Hey, Sam, real quick to interrupt.
Yeah.
That increase of 25%, do we have any idea of what impact that has or what that dollar figure looks like statewide do we know that?
It is 31.5 million.
Okay.
From the state.
Because I did hear from some counties at our conference that change alone is significant in some counties. So thanks for having that.
Yeah, it should be very significant. The House DHHS budget included a few other MAC priorities, one being an increase to foster care parent per diems. It's an 8% increase that amounts to 19.3 million. This also puts Michigan above the national average for foster care per diems. So we'd like to see, incentivization of foster care parents here. Another MAC priority, we wanted to see additional funds from the state for juvenile justice facilities. The House DHHS budget appropriated 25 million to build a facility in northern Michigan. And then the last thing is 14 million in the House budget for the state share for local public health departments. The governor's recommendation was 30 million, so they're just under half to meet that state share. As far as the Senate DHHS budget goes, it does look pretty different than the House version. Again, they do have the 75% child care fund reimbursement rate. They do not have the funding for the juvenile justice facility. Also don't believe they have the foster care parent per diem increase. But they did fully fund the governor's rec for 30 million towards local public health departments.
Great.
Moving on from that, as far as Lara goes, the only piece in the Lara budget that really concerns counties is the Michigan Indigent Defense Commission. The governor's budget rec was $72 million increase to fund Standard 8 from the MIDC, which is the attorney compensation standard. That 72 million, from what I've been told, is a pretty bare minimum dollar amount to fund Standard 8. The Senate funded Standard 8, or the increase that is, at 59 million, the House at 57. So just keep in mind, in the event that MIDC is not fully funded, counties do not have to comply with Standard 8. The remainder of the standards, they're already in place. The funding is there. You'll continue to receive that grant funding and you'll comply with those. But if they don't implement that 72 million, no compliance is necessary, at least for the current fiscal year, or the upcoming rather.
Yeah, so just to clarify, that MID's grant funding you're referring to is not for standards, 1 through 7 that have been instituted already or something like that,
Yeah.
right? So that funding's already in a budget or paid for, I guess.
Yes.
This is just to fund new standards. And since the new standards weren't funded, we're not required to comply with that standard, right?
Right. Yeah. Full funding for MIDC for all 8 standards for fiscal year 24 would be 220 million. The House has it at 204 and the Senate at 208. So again, yeah, without the full funding for the increase, at least Standard 8, no compliance there. But that's yet to be determined until we see the final budget that gets signed.
Of course, right.
And then the last piece I have was within the Senate general government budget. They recommended to create a new program within the Attorney General's office. It's meant to assist communities with high crime and really prosecutors' offices, although that funding is within the AG's office. That's $10 million, which would create 45 full-time positions. So additional assistant attorney generals really to assist at the local level. Our preference would have been dollars directly to counties and in turn, county prosecutors' offices. which I think is unlikely to see, frankly, in the final budget, but at least there's some consideration from the state that local prosecutors do need assistance.
Right. Obviously, if there's going to start being a discrepancy in pay on both sides, you want it to try to be as equal as possible. So interesting, if we take a step back and just recap on look at what you guys just talked about, and then look at the time frame we're talking about. So you have some pretty significant discrepancies between the House and Senate and their budgets, right? I mean, some big dollar figures, some creative accounting in some instances, things like that. We don't have a CREC until the 19th. So that's, 2-3 weeks away, 2.5 weeks or so away. They want a budget done by the 31st. That gives them a week and a half after CREC to get a full budget done with significant discrepancies with the newer legislature. I don't know if I'm
ambitious.
Yes, that's a great term for it. Probably nicer than I would have said. So I'm glad you stepped in there. But seems aggressive, ambitious is a good way of putting it. And there's obviously work that's going to go on between now and CREC, but that CREC, if CREC comes in low, watch out, right? I mean, it's there's going to be a lot of changes that need to occur. Now, it comes in higher, it makes things easier, I think, but we'll see on that. So anything I missed on budgets? I think you guys did a great job there recapping those. Do you guys have anything else?
If I had one takeaway, it would be if after CREC and it comes in low and the state doesn't fund, at least for fiscal year 24, the child care fund, like I mentioned, there's bills that are going to be introduced. And once those are signed, the state will not have a choice but to increase to 75. So if we don't see it this year, we'll see it in fiscal year 25 regardless.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and some of the annual appropriations that have an effect are only 1-year effects too. At this point, that we could see an additional $500 million just from that income tax rollback 1 year between now and next budget year. So that's some significant changes there too. All right, let's go to a quick recap of our conference. We had over 300 attendees at our conference here in Lansing. Madeline, you go first. What was your favorite part of the conference? This is, I think, your guys' only second conference, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So what was your favorite part of this conference?
So this was our second conference, but our first conference in Lansing, our first
Correct.
legislative conference. So my favorite part was getting the quadrant panel up there, getting to ask some of the legislators some pressing questions from our members, watching how they all responded very differently. That's always interesting. And I thought it was a great panel, and I thought they all had thoughtful responses.
Yeah, agreed. Sam, how about you?
I'd have to agree with the quadrant. And aside from, socializing with everyone at the reception, I have to say all 4 breakouts sessions that I was in last week were all very well attended. I think members really enjoyed them. At least that was my perception from everyone. Just overall really informative. I think everyone left with a better understanding of their concerns, and Amy from our office did a great job with her opioid seminar. So
yeah, I think most of our, if not all of them, I didn't get into all the breakouts, but from what staff had reported, most breakouts were packed, and even some of them were more people attended than we could even predict, which happens sometimes. But yeah, I think I agree with both you guys. The quadrant. This, of course, is not my second conference. I don't even care to reflect on how many conferences I've been to, but I will say that Tammy did a great job, our conference coordinator. I thought the stage setting was fantastic. I thought we had a lot of new faces at this conference, which is not typical. We usually see about the same people we always see, but we had a lot of new commissioners that had just gotten elected attend, which is great. And hopefully that'll continue going forward. So, kudos to Tammy and Derek and the whole team here. Everyone stepped up and did a great job. You guys, being able to follow these budgets at the same time, a lot of moving parts last week. A lot of people worked hard and some long hours. So thanks to everyone on the MAC staff. for doing that and putting in the effort. I certainly appreciate it, and I'm sure our members do as well. So before we close things out here, anything else you guys want to talk about?
That's everything for me.
Yeah,
it's-
we're headed up to the Ludington area this evening for West Central's
Yeah, and
meeting. So that'll be fun.
unfortunately, it's May 1st, and you may have snow, encounter some snow on that drive
Sure.
up there. So, which is kind of, well, it's Michigan.
With my luck, there will be snow. So
Sam's driving, so
yeah.
Well, drive safe, guys. Thanks for doing that. And thanks for everyone for tuning into the podcast. And we'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Podcast 83.